Welcome to Seed World Strategy webinar. Today we're going to try and answer the question, what exactly are seed treatments worth? As many of you know, my name is Julie Deering. I serve as the editor of Seed World, and today I'm your host. Before we begin, I'd like to thank our sponsors, BASF, Bayer, and Syngenta for their support. I also want to let you know that this webinar is being recorded and will be made available on seedworld.com following the event. As we go along, if you have any questions or comments, please type them into the chat box and we'll do our best to address them. Today, our speakers are Paula Peterson of Syngenta Seed Care, Jason Bond of Southern Illinois University, and Sean Conley of the University of Madison. Throughout our time here, they're going to discuss the value of seed treatments and take a look at the return on investment, disease pressures, and how seed treatments impact replant decisions. After the presentations, we'll open it up for questions. As I already mentioned, if you have any questions, just type them into the chat box and we'll make sure our speakers have a chance to address them. So let's go ahead and get started. Our first speaker is Paula Peterson. He was named Head of Seed Care Product Marketing in March of 2015. Paula joined Syngenta in 2010 and has since held a variety of roles on the Syngenta Seed Care technical team, including heading up the Seed Care R&D and the Seed Care Institute in Stanton, Minnesota. Before joining Syngenta, Paula was an associate professor at Iowa State University, where he coordinated and provided state leadership in soybean production and management, splitting his time between extension work and research. Paula received his doctorate in agronomy and plant pathology from the University of Wisconsin-Madison and a master's of business administration from the Fuqua School of Business Global Executive Program at Duke University. Paula, thanks for being here with us today. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Julie, and good afternoon, everybody. So today I'm going to talk about the value of seed treatments. So why is this topic so important? Well, recently there has been a lot of talk about the impact of the low commodity prices on farmers' profitability. There has been a lot of talk about are seed treatment really needed? And that really got us back to talk about the basics about why do we really use seed treatment? Why did we start developing seed treatments, and why have farmers adopted to seed treatment so quickly and really utilize them as technology today to maximize their yield and protect the genetic yield potential? So first of all, I think it's a key thing. A lot of plant physiologists and agronomists at the land-grant university have done a lot of work looking at the impact of early planting to maximize yield. And I'm going to give examples here over the next 10 to 12 minutes about soybeans. So soybeans, we know, are very responsive to early planting. The earlier we plant, as long as the seed bed is in good condition, the higher yield a lot of time the farmers will achieve. So it's very critical that when we plant into these cool, wet conditions, that we have a right protection to get uniform emergence and, of course, get a higher stand establishment. Another thing is also when you're planting early into cool and well soil, there is a possibility that you can get a late killing freeze, or the temperatures can sit back, be very cool for a long time. By using seed treatment, a lot of times we know we will minimize the risk of replanting. And we have seen over many studies that a lot of times when you're using a fungicide insecticide seed treatment like Maxx Vibrance, despite you don't have maybe the optimum plant populations out there, those plants are so healthy and they will compensate for space that a lot of times you will not see the same kind of yield penalty that you would see if you didn't have a seed treatment on. So last, of course, they will give you an early season protection against early season insects, diseases, and nematodes. But one key question that is out there that is very important is the farmer is asking question, what kind of seed treatment are they buying? Because there are many different seed treatments in the market. A lot of times, many of the seed treatments will have the same color, but the amount of active ingredients and what kind of active ingredients are on the seed are not the same. So I think a key question is, can you as a grower afford to use a seed treatment that you don't know what it is and there's no data to support when we're dealing with $9 bushel beans? $9 bushel beans is all about every bushel. You need to cover every bushel to try to maximize your yield and to minimize potential yield loss you will get in these low-cost environments. So we in Syngenta have been in the seed care business for many years, and we have a lot of experience with that. The first product we brought to the market was 1979. And there's no other companies out there in the industry that have brought more active ingredients into the market or have the experience that we have today. We have a dedicated sales and agronomic sales force throughout the country working in different crops that can really help growers to support this. And we've done a lot of trialing. I will talk about soybeans today, and I will give you examples about soybeans. We have done thousands, if not 10,000 of trials in this, and we understand very well how the environmental conditions and how varieties are interfering with the performance of seed treatments and the benefits these seed treatments will have. So I will give you a couple of examples, and I will really start to put it around our foundation seed treatment from Syngenta is Cruiser Maxx Vibrance. Cruiser Maxx Vibrance is the most commonly used seed treatment in the soybean industry. It is the latest premix from Syngenta. They have the most comprehensive insecticide and fungicide seed treatment. It has 4 different active ingredients in it. One insecticide, which is dimethoxam, and then you got 3 fungicides, mefenoxam, fludioxonil, and sidaxane. The key benefit of this product is that, of course, it will increase your genetic yield potential by protecting it against early season insect and diseases. It has very good tolerance and crop stress, and I will give you an example on that. That it will, because of its very good root structure and root health, no phytotoxicity on the crop at all. It really will help optimize the plant vigor and the root health early on. So if you are in an environment where you don't have the optimum amount of water available to the plant, then you're going to see more consistency in the yield. It will help farmers to cover all his acreage at the appropriate time. A lot of time the farmers today, they have so many acres that they don't have time to scout every field every day for particularly early season insects. It's very easy to operate and to apply from an operation standpoint. So the retailers that will be treating your seed, it's a very easy to apply product, very little complexity. And then of course the quality has been supported and proven. And if you don't know that, our first Cruiser Maxx bean brand was launched in the United States for more than 10 years ago, and we have a lot of experience with that. But I will give a couple of examples why seed treatment are so critical even in the low commodity price. And I will use 2 active ingredients to give an example. I will use dimethoxam, and then I will use sidaxane, which is also known as Vibrance. So in addition to give you early season insects protection, dimethoxam or Cruiser will also give the plant a more vigorous growth. And that's a great example here. We have seen it from a vigor effect, which is also patented by Syngenta. We see a more uniform emergence, more rapid growth in early season, and there are many reasons for that. We have worked on this for more than a decade to better understanding all this, but there are some clear indications. One of the things that we're seeing is we see an increased ability for the plants to take up nutrients, and particularly phosphate if you're in a low phosphate environment. We see an improved translocation of nitrogen in the plant. We see a better balance uptake of nutrients. And then because of the healthy root system, we see an improved nodulation from optimized pH in the rhizosphere around the roots. So this is some of the additional benefit, and one of the reasons why we have a lot of times have seen a consistent yield increase in absence of insects, because of these growth enhancing benefits that we're getting on top of the insecticide protection from early season insects. Another thing, I'll give you an example from the Cruiser Maxx Vibrance product, is what we call is Vibrance or sidaxane. That is the newest mode of action of fungicides we have in our soybean premix. It's an HDHI chemistry. It has an ideal systemic activity and soil mobility. It has a robust activity under various environmental conditions. So it doesn't matter if it's cool and wet or hot and dry. The compound is mobilizing very well in the root system. The use rate is extremely low, and there's outstanding seed safety data on it to support it. So we have worked on that. It was first launched back in 2012, and is now used in most crops in the United States. We see a very nice yield, increased yield potential and yield stability. And the yield stability, you can see that down in the bottom left corner. where we're looking at the graph, the effect of yield distribution. So a lot of times when we are plotting out data from thousands of data points, we will look at the distribution and where the curve will be skewing. And one of the things that we are seeing with Vibrance is that the peak of the curve is taller, but it's also much more narrow, so you get a more consistency across environmental conditions. And the reason we do that is we have, as you can see, the center of the slide, at the bottom in the center, we see an enhanced root development. We start seeing that early on cereals in Europe, where we saw an enhanced growth using the compound in absence of pathogens. And now we start seeing it in other crops that we see, in addition to extreme good root protection, particularly against Rhizoctonia, which this active ingredient works very well on. We also see this nice enhanced root development that really help us to give us more consistency, particularly under these very high stress environment. It gives us larger root surface areas. It gives you more root forks or tips in the root system. So overall, it's a compound that has additional benefits and not just give you Rhizoctonia protection that we know it works very well against. And then the last thing is, of course, what does all this mean? Well, this is all about dollars, and you will hear that from the other presenters. But for growers right now at $9 bushel beans, what does this mean in return on investment? And when you're looking at the three different benefits, so the yield increase of Cruiser Maxx Vibrance if you're not treating your beans, we see a benefit on average across our trials at a 4.5 bushel. So if you're at $9 bushel beans, that's $40.50. And of course, the price that is charged out there depends, of course, of the retail locations. But most people are selling Cruiser Maxx Vibrance in the range from, I would say, $13 to $16. In addition to that, you will give you a higher tolerance to crop stress. I showed you that before. And then you will have less replant because of the health of the plants, that the plants will be able to compensate much better to stress. So overall, it's a very attractive return on investment if growers, for example, spend $14 a unit looking at the yield benefit we're seeing. And then on top of that, don't forget the quicker canopy closure that you're seeing with the vigor effect, that particularly now where we start seeing more challenges with weed management, with quicker canopy closure, you will have a better chance to manage your weeds in your field compared to if you do not have the same kind of canopy closure. And then the last thing, I just want to remember that, as I said earlier, Syngenta have been in this for 37 years. We are the largest seed treatment providers in the United States, and particularly in soybeans. And it's not just a product when you're buying a product from us. We're also giving you a lot of services. We are standing behind our product. We want our customers to be the best stewards of our product. And we do that through our Seed Care Institute networks. In U.S., we have a brand new Seed Care Institute in Stanton, Minnesota, where we will work with our customers in recipe development, application quality, stewardship training, seed safety biology, and of course marketing support. The key thing is this, that the seed treatment is the most secure investment that you as a grower can do to protect that genetic yield potential, to maximize yield. And we in Syngenta, we stand behind our product. We stand behind our R&D that have been behind to developing this product, and we have decades of years of experience. So thank you, Julie, and I will hand it over to Jason.
Great, thanks, Paula. I appreciate you sharing that knowledge there. Next step, we have Jason Bond. Jason is a second-generation plant pathologist, and he was raised on a watermelon farm in southeastern Louisiana. He received his PhD in plant health from Louisiana State University in 1999. Today, Jason is a professor of plant health in the College of Agricultural Sciences at Southern Illinois University, where he also serves as the director of the Illinois Soybean Center. His research and teaching program focus on disease management and row crops in the Midwest. Additionally, he advises the Agronomy Society, an RSO that provides opportunities for undergraduates and graduate students to grow in leadership and professional development. And Jason is going to talk to us about the disease pressures seedlings have to overcome. Jason, I'll let you take it from here.
Thank you, Julie. There's a really good setup by Pella in terms of some of the just the overall diversity in terms of some of the tools that are available for controlling some of the constraints that we have as it relates to soybean production. And these are just some of the seed treatment targets that are out there. We'll spend most of our time focusing on mycetes and also fungi today, but obviously there's a lot of other things that are also kind of all coming together at the same time when we're trying to get a good crop established. And when we just focus on seedling diseases, now these are going to just be those diseases that are going to occur in the first maybe few weeks of the season. There's estimated over 47 million bushels of soybeans are lost annually in the United States. So this is a very ever-present problem that we deal with. And one of the most difficult things that we deal with, and this is even true for plant pathologists who study this, is we typically only give attention to when we see disease in the field, when we see sick plants. And that sometimes gives us a false impression on really the true level of infestation of the organisms that's in our fields. So just because we don't see disease in some years, that does not mean the pathogens are not present in the soil. Most of what we'll talk about today are organisms that have been here before we started using our fields and will be here long after our grandchildren inherit the fields that are being used. The greatest impact of the seedling diseases that we'll focus on today is really within the first 30 days after planting. And the goal is for us to be able to protect the plants during this most vulnerable stage. And after plants get past this real vulnerable stage, they start developing some natural resistance mechanisms that do start kind of helping protect the roots. So the seedling diseases that are problematic early in the year, the pathogens are still there late in the season, but the plants have started developing some of the natural resistance to deal with them. So if we can protect them for that first 2 weeks to 30 days, we can kind of get them out of this most vulnerable period. As in general, for most of these, we can't deal with this vulnerability in this first 30 days by just choosing our soybean varieties. They may have some that deal with the amount of damage a little different than one another, but there's not really like a silver bullet in terms of selecting resistant varieties for these. And the reason for this is because when we talk about seedling disease pathogens, it's a huge complex of organisms. So there's Phytophthora sojii and also other species that attack soybean. For Pythium, there's many species. For Fusarium, there's at least 7 or more important species that we find. Rhizoctonia, Solani, Phomopsis, and there's also some other genera that are important. But for the most part, sometimes when we see the word Pythium or Fusarium, we think of a single entity, but it's much more complex than that. I wish it was just one organism, but it's actually many organisms, and that's where variability sometimes occurs within across years or maybe even across fields on a particular farm, and why knowing what seed treatment is being used is very important, because some seed treatments do a good job across the entire spectrum where there may be some holes for certain active ingredients and you kind of need to know what you're dealing with in those fields to be able to ascertain why did something not work. So the first slide I showed you, those are organisms that are the classical causes of seedling disease. There's also a whole range of pathogens that attack the plants during the seedling stage, but we don't attribute that to seedling disease. Those are usually like mid-season to late season when they really start causing great impact on the plant. A good example of that is soybean cyst nematode, sudden death syndrome. We see it in August in our foliar symptoms in the plants that the pathogen is causing, but all of the invasion and colonization of the plants, that happened in the first few weeks of its life. So even though it's not a true seedling disease, it is a pathogen that attacks during the seedling stage. And we also have Macrophamina phaseolina, that's a charcoal rot pathogen. It is really in every field as well. And so we have a whole range of pathogens that get into the plants. And if it's kind of a wet year, you might see the symptoms of sudden death syndrome. If it's a dry year, kind of hot, you'll see more expressions of the charcoal rot syndrome. So wide distribution and wide diversity in our fields. And that's one of the questions that we often get is, how prevalent are these seedling disease pathogens? And then the second question is, does the presence of the pathogen always result in sick plants or poor stand? And to answer the first question, the United Soybean Board and also the North Central Research Program and also the United States Department of Agriculture funded a wide wide grant over many states, and this was done over multiple years. And all of the little dots and circles that you see on this map represent fields that were visited that had symptomatic plants. Those symptomatic plants or plants showing seedling disease were then taken back to the labs at each of these states, and they would then start isolating or collecting the individuals that were inside those sick plants. So just to kind of give you a rundown, if they were to walk out into a field, and if you see on the left-hand panel, you see the little seedling that is damping off, they would collect that seedling. In the center of that slide, you see a little petri dish, and right in the center, that's a part of the sick or the symptomatic tissue would be placed on that artificial medium. And then after a time of incubation, maybe just a couple days, maybe it's a week, you will see on the right-hand side all of the different types of organisms. So these things can be very pretty. They can be all these different variations in color and growth. And they would collected many thousands. I think it was somewhere between 4,000 and 5,000 total isolates were collected. And then we had to move into the process of, okay, we were able to get these organisms from sick tissue, but were all of them responsible for the diseases that they were causing? So this would give you the total fungi that were present from seedlings. So if you look at all in this pie chart, the greatest or the most dominant genus that we found was Fusarium. Almost 75% of the samples were typed out to that genus. And a lot of other important pathogens. We see Rhizoctonia there, Macrophamina. Now, one thing to keep in mind is these individuals went out at one time of the season in very cool, very damp conditions. So you could have gone out maybe 2 or 3 weeks later and you might not have seen as much Fusarium, but maybe a higher percentage of Rhizoctonia. So that's important to keep in mind, is that this is just at one point of the season. But it's concerning enough just with the diversity, what was found. If you look at just a snapshot of within the genus Fusarium, we see many species. Many of these are known soybean pathogens. Many of these are known corn and wheat pathogens. And why some of these were inside of our soybean roots, this is kind of our first report on some of this, so a lot of this has to be followed up on. We don't know if some of these corn and wheat pathogens are causing damage to the soybean seedlings. It's concerning enough that things that we kind of thought only occurred in our corn and our corn and wheat crops are now being found in the soybean, because that would at the very least allow them to be a kind of a harbor, the soybean crop, to when we grow our corn and our wheat crops. So those are kind of a snapshot on the true fungi. If you look at Pythium and also some of the other oomycetes, they found over 82 oomycete species, and you can see that there's a lot of text on this slide. That's just the individual species, and then they also show you kind of the frequency in which they were observed. But really the most important thing to look on here is that there were many species of Pythium that were found, and many of these only 13 in the literature have been reported to be known as pathogens. So many of these we've followed up in the greenhouse, and we're finding out that they too are bad in terms of soybean health. So there's a huge range and diversity even within just that one genus of Pythium, and that's just kind of overwhelming. The scientists were really shocked to see this level of diversity. So really the take home from that large project is the fields are infested with more than one seedling pathogen. It is not just like when we think about soybean cyst nematode, it just being a nematode or one type of nematode that's in the field. These are very many genera, many species. And as I said, the distribution and diversity really surprised the researchers. People that really love to work on these pathogens, it even surprised us. And the field level research, so this would be following up on some of those research sites, maybe on research research stations at the universities, and even on producer fields. We were finding that many of these fields did in fact have many species of Pythium and also many species of these other fungal pathogens. So it's not just a single thing to focus on. The other question we have is, so we know our fields are infested and there's a great abundance of diversity of these pathogens in our soil, and they're ever present. They don't blow into your field, they live there. You know, they're constantly cycling in your soil. So if they're there, does that always result in sick plants or poor stand? And many of us have seen this. If you've ever taken a plant pathology class or been to an extension talk, you've probably seen this, but it's the plant disease triangle, and it perfectly describes the situation here. So to have disease, we obviously need to have a plant host that's susceptible. We need to have the pathogen, and we've established that these pathogens are in our fields, and when we're planting our soybeans in these crops, we're certainly providing this susceptible host. The last component of that is, if we're going to see disease, we must have a suitable environment, not only for the soybean plant to grow, but also for the pathogen to be able to grow. And each of these pathogens, and I just have a summary here, there's a huge range when you usually find them in greater incidence, and they can be over a very narrow range or a very wide range depending on the year. So some years we have really bad problems with Pythium. Other years we might have a little bit more of a problem with Rosactonia, and that's mainly due to just the shifting in the environment. Sometimes it's just based on how cool it was that spring. It might be because we had a planting delay and we planted a little bit later, and maybe the soil temperatures were a little bit warmer, so we just didn't see as much of the disease. But one of the things just to keep in mind is that when we don't see disease, it's not because the pathogen is probably not there. That's not what's going on. It's just the environment wasn't suitable for it to cause disease. So the good thing is that the pressure is often contained if we use the right seed treatment, and if we choose a seed treatment. There are cases, obviously, when you plant, if you used naked seed, or you could possibly escape disease in any given year, depending on if the environmental conditions were conducive for you to get to be able to do that. But by and large, with the desire to plant earlier and earlier, we're planting into conditions where there's going to be a higher frequency that we will have conditions for these pathogens. So that concludes my talk. I'll turn it back over to Julie.
Great, thank you, Jason, and I'm excited to follow your research as you dig into that a little bit more in terms of the presence of the different diseases and the pressures there. Our final speaker for today is Sean Conley. Sean is a professor of agronomy and the state soybean and small grain specialist at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. His research goal is to generate science-based solutions to address real-world problems in soybean and small grain production. This knowledge has been integrated and delivered through his extension program. Sean has authored or co-authored 70 refereed journal articles, 100 scientific abstracts, and the children's book, Cool Bean the Soybean. Sean, thanks for making yourself available today. Let's take a look at what your research shows.
All right, thank you, Julie, and everyone in attendance today. And just as a friendly reminder, if anyone has any follow-up questions, you can feel free to tag me on Twitter, that's @BadgerBean, or go to my website, which is coolbean.info. Feel free to drop me some emails if we don't get a chance to cover those questions here during this webinar today. So today what I really want to focus in on is looking at some of the agronomic advantages and benefits of soybean seed treatments. And this is kind of a compilation of many research studies that we've done over the last 10 years that I've been at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. So feel free again to raise your hand, ask some questions, and kind of keep this as open and informal as possible. So when we get into this, what I really want to step back and first of all look at what are those agronomic realities of what growers are doing. We're able to collect some of this data on a benchmarking project that was funded by the North Central Soybean Research Program. So if you look across these three different images here, we'll start on the left-hand side. Based on crop reporting districts, we get a good sense of what the average planting date is and how that shifts from anywhere from North Dakota down to Kansas over to Michigan and Ohio. So again, it gives us a good opportunity to understand that component of early planting. I know Pella Pedersen has spoken about that earlier, that we tend to see, at least in Wisconsin, and parts of Nebraska and many points in between, that in general, once we start delaying planting past May 1, we tend to see roughly 0.4 to 0.5 bushel per acre per day yield loss. So again, roughly, if you're speaking to a grower, guy I'm about to do here in Wisconsin, I would tell growers basically every day, for every 10 days you delay, you're losing somewhere between 4 and 5 bushels. So again, we're really trying to push growers to get in there and plant early. The other agronomic realities that we've seen is a significant reduction in what growers are dropping. And a lot of this is driven obviously by the environment and planting conditions. But if you look across most of the north central region, most farmers are dropping somewhere between 140 and 160,000 seeds per acre. I think that's pretty common and consistent across the country. Obviously, some areas are a little bit more, others are less, but again, that's the biggest driver. Bottom right hand is we see what percentage of farmers are actually using seed treatments. And this is kind of an interesting component because much of the data that we've heard from industry is 80% of farmers are treating their beans. And again, we didn't really have any way to validate that. So again, given the information we can see across most of the soybean production area, we are at that 80 to 100% of soybeans that are being treated across this area. And again, the interesting thing that we want to then ask is, so if this is what growers are doing, what is that probability that growers are getting a positive return on investment from that practice? Next slide, please. So back a few years ago, we started with this first treatment looking at what is that economic risk and profitability of utilizing soybean fungicide and insecticide seed treatments at some reduced seeding rates. This paper is published. You can either go to my website, coolbean.info, or if you want to read the long crop science version, that is shown right here. But those where you see all those little soybean marks, those are all the locations across the state of Wisconsin. Really what we did is we looked at using an untreated seed, an Apron Max, or the Apron Max plus the Cruiser Max. This, again, was before the Vibrance treatment came out and was added to that treatment list. We also looked at seeding rates going from 40,000 to 140,000 seeds per acre. And again, the reason behind that is looking at if there was a stand issue, at what point should growers think about replanting, or where should they be filling in or making some adjustments in how many seeds those soybeans would be dropped. And more specifically, is there an interaction with seed treatments and seeding rates that growers can offset some of that cost of that additional seed treatment by reducing their seeding rate and still getting a positive return on investment? Next slide, please. So this is basically a graph that shows what we've known for a long time, but it's always nice to validate this. In short, all farmers need on, I would say, 70 to 80% of their soybean acres is 100,000 plants per acre at harvest to maximize yield. Again, that's if growers are going in, planting early, getting good establishment, having good weed control. That's their target. If you are a farmer that maybe lives a little bit further north, we start going to that North Dakota, into Canada, or you're on more of a droughtier soil, and by droughty I can mean a tight clay or a sandy loam, then I like to push growers to having about 140,000 seeds, or excuse me, plants per acre at harvest to help maximize that yield. And again, the thing that's always interesting is farmers always think, they look at me weird when I say that, but it's the exact opposite in soybeans as you see in corn. So in a droughty situation, you actually drop your population in field corn, you jack it up, or you increase it in soybean. Next slide, please. This is a chart that we did. Again, this was part of this research project. We were also looking at what point should we fill in. And the main point I want to look, if you look at those orange figures in the middle, okay, what that kind of shows, or those orange bars I should say, is that if you plant, or you have a stand of 40,000 plants per acre, that is about the only time a grower should ever think about doing any type of filling in or rescuing that. I guess in short, what I tell growers is 100,000 and up maximizes yield. Between 50 and 100,000 seeds per acre, don't touch it, leave it alone. You get under 50,000 plants per acre, that's the point. You should go in and fill it in, but never tear it up and start over. Basically, that was the economics of this figure right here. However, no grower ever believes me when I make that comment. What we did is we took all of this data and we started with this BeanCam Replant Decision app. This can be downloaded for free from either the Android or the Apple Store. Again, this was a product sponsored by the Wisconsin Soybean Marketing Board. We basically took all of our seed treatment, all of our population data, all of that information and put it in this app. If you look in the upper left-hand corner, that figure right there, that is what you see on your camera. So you basically line your lines up on those rows. You snap some pictures. On the bottom right-hand corner is what your app sees. Okay, that sees those green foliage, and that's what it's calculating in terms of making a replant decision and how much stand and leaf area is out there. Next slide, please. This is an example of one of my graduate students, Marion Lund, out using this app. And if you look on the kind of a light pale green, after you go through it, you make basically 5 pictures across that field. It gives you an average count per picture, and our estimated population is 80,300 plants per acre. And our percent maximum yield is 97%. So again, it falls right into line with the fact that between 50 and 100,000, you shouldn't touch it. To add to that, if some growers would prefer that they did add or fill in some of these thin spots, our recommended replant rate is about 60,000. Right there you see 59,673. But by adding that 60,000 seeds, you only get 1% back in terms of yield. So again, this is another mechanism to encourage growers in those marginal areas where they get a little concerned. Don't replant. Don't fill it in unless it's under 50,000. I'd much rather have a grower or co-op put a herbicide out there in crop season to manage those weeds instead of using the crop competition to do that. Next slide, please. Now if we get back and look at the other main effect, we spoke about seeding rate, seed treatment. What we tend to see in Wisconsin over the last 10 years is that the second generation neonicotinoids tend to give us always a positive return on investment. Here's an example. In this case, we were looking at Cruiser Max, and we saw that roughly 2.5 bushel yield advantage to using that seed treatment across all of our environments. Next slide, please. And where we tend to see the biggest response to this, and Pella had mentioned this earlier, is in our early planted soybeans. And where we see this, if you look in this figure right here, this table, see your planting date early, mid, and late. We were able to physically measure higher photosynthetic rate and higher leaf area through cumulative NDVI with this thiamethoxam or Cruiser in our early planting days. So again, when I look at this, the best bang for your buck for trying to get maximized soybean yield is plant early and utilize, in this case it was thiamethoxam, to be able to get the biggest bang for your buck for maximizing yield. And again, we can measure both, I think it's a function of both greater stand and more leaf area in these two cases, so we could measure both the NDVI and the CIPAR. Next slide, please. Now, if you want to separate this out and look at the effect of the seed treatment by population interaction, here's a good figure we can look at. And if you look at the top blue line, the Cruiser Max one, that's a solid dark blue line, a couple of things we want to point out here is, regardless of what seeding rate you drop, that seeding, you saw a significant yield increase across all of those populations from 40 to 140,000. The other cool thing is if you look down and you go up from that 40,000 up to where that the last solid blue line is, where it's Cruiser Max, you see that there's actually a higher floor put in. So again, it helps on the downside risk, is that the low isn't as low when you utilize, in this case, it's thiamethoxam. So it's pretty cool and pretty interesting that you have that protection and downside risk conversion in this case. Next slide, please. So one of the things we also did is wanted to put this risk table together for farmers to see, because each farmer has a little bit of varying risk of what they're willing to accept. So if you look here, and what we're going to do is comparing this seed treatment, in this case Cruiser Max at 140,000, what's the probability you're going to get a return on investment with this seed treatment by population versus untreated at 140,000. So the break-even probability is 71%, where you see that 0.71. If you go over to positive outcomes, on average, you're going to have 18. So basically, on the positive parts of the field, you're going to make $18 an hour, not an hour, an acre. If you go to all outcomes, average over all of our population environments, you're going to have a $10 per acre increase in profitability. And again, if you go over the negative outcomes, we do see in some cases you lose some money. But again, if you look on average, comparing a Cruiser Max at 140,000 seeds per acre, compared against untreated at 140, you're going to average $10 an acre in terms of your return on investment, percent average profit increase. And then the probability of return on investment is 71%. So again, most people will take that and go to Vegas all day long. Next slide, please. We also did a similar type of an experiment that was just kind of posted on my website, looking at iLevo. And again, in this case, you see it's $8 per bushel beans. And commodity prices are a little lower than when this data came out. And we see very similar type of responses in terms of the probability of return on investment and where you can utilize this seed treatment combination, again, on where we may see some SDS or those type of environments. But again, feel free to go to my website, which is coolbean.info. Both these figures are on there under the soybean research drop-down menu. Next slide, please. So with that, I'd just like to remind everyone that please go, if you have any further questions, go to coolbean.info. Everything I do goes on that webpage. Tag me or follow me at Badger Bean. And during the growing season, if you're looking for soybean updates and what we're seeing in the field, go to the soyreport.blogspot.com. So with that, Julie, I'm going to turn it over to questions from the audience.
Great. Thanks so much, Sean. At this time, we are opening it up to questions from the audience for our speakers. And so I do have one that has come in. If you have questions, please type them in the chat box. The first one that came in is, how can we recognize Fusarium and Phytophthora in the nursery? And Jason, I'll direct that to you.
All right. That's an excellent question. I will say that for a lot of these pathogens, sometimes it's not just to go out and make a diagnosis. There could be multiple things in one field, and in this case, if it's maybe a disease nursery, that when I see that term, that means that maybe I'm evaluating varieties and things of that nature. I'm not sure if that's what the intent of the question was, but if I was to go into a field where I was expecting some seedling diseases and I saw something and I'm wondering could it be Phytophthora or Fusarium, one of the things that usually is a guide that I use is, okay, what were the environmental conditions that were leading up to the symptomology? So it wouldn't have been just like the day before and things of that nature. If we're seeing sick plants, it would have probably been something that we're looking at. Maybe you're looking back maybe a week ago, maybe 10 days ago. What were the environmental conditions like then? Fusarium root rot and also seedling blight would typically be soil temperatures that are 57 degrees, maybe a little cooler. With Phytophthora, typically it's going to be a little bit warmer soil type, so maybe a little bit anything over 60 degrees Fahrenheit. Still moist, but not real cold soil compared to maybe what we'd see with Fusarium and even with Pythium. So that's one of the things. I kind of use environment to guide us. Typically with Phytophthora blight, if you have it's going to be, sometimes it can be associated with where you've had maybe a little bit more water standing, where Fusarium would not be as constricted to be where you had as much water. You know, I mean, they both like those moist conditions, but Phytophthora and Pythium sometimes are driven even more severe by some standing water. So sometimes the pattern in the field will give us a little bit of a guidance on what was it an oomycete or was it a true fungus, and then also looking at the types of maybe if the plants are damping off. If you're getting some seed rots and things of that nature, that's going to lend more to a Phytophthora than it would be Fusarium. Fusarium does in fact discolor the roots. More of a stunting, and you can get death, but it's Phytophthora tends to be, when it's showing up, it's going to be a lot more aggressive. So one or two plants here or there sometimes is not a good indication you're probably dealing with Phytophthora if you've had the right temperatures and the right moisture. If you're seeing it show up in a plant or two, it should be more than just those few plants. And then later in the year, sometimes if you If you didn't take a sample and you didn't send it to one of the disease clinics, I will say that all of the state universities have excellent disease clinics in this part of the country. It will take more than a day probably to identify what the causal agent is, because it just takes a little while to tease them out of these roots. There are some molecular tools that are being brought online at the disease clinics to speed that up. But even at later in the year, sometimes those areas that have had problems with Phytophthora early season will start showing up in some of the late season Phytophthora symptoms. And if you're seeing that, that's also a good indication of what you saw earlier in the year was Phytophthora, not Fusarium, because the Fusarium seedling diseases don't typically translate into problems that you would see showing up in the foliage in August. Phytophthora, yes. The Fusarium that causes sudden death syndrome, yes, but not the typical Fusarium seedling pathogens.
Great, thanks, Jason. And I've got one question for each of you, and I'm going to ask Sean first because I know he's got to jump off at 12:50 promptly. What does your future research, or how are you continuing your work in this area, and what do those projects look like, and what will they be encompassing? Sean, can you take the lead on that one?
Sorry about that. I was getting a phone call coming in, and my phone got screwed up on me. So could you please repeat that question, please?
Sure, no problem. I was asking about what your future work in this area entails.
You bet. So we spend a lot of time basically listening to what growers are asking questions on. So most of this research that I spoke about today was funded by the Wisconsin Soybean Marketing Board, and we're really focusing on grower-related questions in terms of return on investment, looking at the sustainability effects on these, and where do these really fit in. So one of the cool things, and I'm going to speak to this project we have funded through the North Central Soybean Research Program, is to look at can we classify how these different inputs, and in this case seed treatments, work in these different yield environments. So right now we've got, again, that data I showed that 80% of farmers are using seed treatments, and those seed treatments vary based on if they're just a fungicide only, fungicide plus insecticide, but we have all that data. We're characterizing that across the entire Midwest to see in what areas do these seed treatments, fungicide by itself, fungicide plus insecticide, give growers the most bang for their buck or highest return on investment. So I think that's going to be really cool as we get this data. So right now, by the end of this growing season, we should have roughly 700,000 acres of data and roughly 6,000 farm fields of data. And again, if 80% of those are using seed treatments, we can just layer all that data and look at all the weather and soil and all of that information to more specifically and precisely give growers a recommendation that if under this soil type and your planting date is this, the biggest bang for your buck is Y in terms of seed treatment package. So I'm pretty excited about this. This is pretty cool stuff, and I think we're going to get a lot of data that growers are just going to be able to eat up and utilize and help focus their decisions for their farms and their yield levels.
Great, that's awesome. Thanks for sharing. Jason?
Yeah, I'm here.
Sorry, same question to you. Is what does your future work entail in this area?
One of the aspects of the United Soybean Board project and also North Central, they both are continuing funding this project, and this has 12 institutions from around the Midwest and even in the upper or the lower Mid-South region, is to develop, I kind of mentioned this earlier, developing a quick a molecular tool that can be used in all of the disease clinics, both at the universities, but also have it open up to really any industry that would want this this technology. And ultimately, the tools are there. It's just making it a very quick PCR panel that could type out the most common of the seedling pathogens. So we're trying to get this launched into some of the disease clinics later this year to speed that process up and kind of do a proof of concept this year to see how well this works. We're trying to get it to where if you have a problem like Sean was talking about with the replant decisions, I mean, it's kind of interesting to know what caused the problem if we think it's a seedling disease, then to know which types it was, because in fact you could have used seed treatments and maybe the environment was so arduous, you would want to know what pathogen was causing that problem, even with all of the things that you've done and all of the investments you made, because it might be that you need to change the type of seed treatment in the replant. So we want to be able to provide that information back to the producers much quicker than probably the week to 10 days that it takes now, because if you're waiting for somebody to type out some of these real difficult pathogens, you're probably going to make your decision before you get all of the information. It's just taking too long. Some of the things are pretty easy to tell in the field once you've done it for a number of years, and a lot of the agronomists that work for the companies can help identify those things. But it's when you get into some of those fusarium species and some of the Pythium species, to tell them to dissect which one you're actually dealing with, it takes some lab work, and that's where we're hoping some of this technology speeds up the process. And the other component of that is just trying to get a better handle on how some of these species react to differing environmental conditions. One of the things that we see a lot about their diversity, Dr. Allison Robertson up at Iowa State University has found that some of the seed treatments that work very well against some of the Pythium species tend to fall away when maybe the environmental conditions, when it gets a little bit warmer or it gets a little cooler. So that is a nightmare when you're trying to match up against maybe 5 or 6 different Pythium species, and they're doing, the chemical might be working well against some of them, but not others, depending on the environmental conditions. So that's another area of our work, is where across all of the states they're trying to determine the level of how aggressive these pathogens are, and getting a better handle on what drives the diseases. We have these broad, you saw that on one of my slides, these broad areas where they typically work when it's these kind of temperatures and maybe this kind of condition. But to do a little bit better in our prediction on about maybe not only when the pathogens are going to be more severe, but maybe even what types of active ingredients would work best in those environments.
Great, thank you. There's got a lot of good work going on there, and I'll be excited to, again, follow up with you and learn more as your research continues. Paula, can you give us some insight as to what Syngenta is working on in this area?
Well, I just want to follow up on just the comments that Jason just talked about, and I was not as direct in my communication early on, but I'll be a little bit more specific now. This is one of the reasons why farmers need to ask the questions what they are getting on the seed and what rates they're getting. Because we are applying, our active ingredient is applied in milligram active per seed. And if the farmers are not getting what they're paying for, let's say they're getting half the rate, you don't get the full protection out there. Let's just be realistic. Seed treatments are for early season protection. So if the right amount of active ingredient is not on the seed, they're not going to get a lot of protection. And that's why we in Syngenta, well, more than 37 years of experience, we are standing behind our products, and farmers know what they're getting when they're buying a Syngenta product. So there's a clear effect on the amount of active ingredient you're putting on the seed and the protection you're going to get from these diseases like Jason is talking about. So this is something that has been very obvious for us, and we have seen it recently, that this is important, that farmers will start asking questions out there what they're getting on the seed, because red is not equal red. But from a Syngenta standpoint, you saw our portfolio earlier. We have, of course, a great innovation pipeline. Syngenta is an innovation and research company. We invested more than $1.3 billion in research right now, and we have a strong pipeline. We have right now 7 new active ingredient in development for seed care use, both fungicides and insecticides. So we are very fit for the future, and we are working well to understand and really mimic how a farming operation is going to look like in 5 years, to be sure our farmers have the right products available. So we are very excited about this. You know, that's why I love my job, and my team, we love what we're doing, because we will be able to keep delivering products for the demand that the farmer is having out there to help to support the way these operations are changing. So think back to 10 years ago, you know, most farmers were planting soybeans in late May, and now they're planting them in late April. Who knew that Pythium would be such a big problem today? 10 years ago, everybody talked about Phytophthora, and they talked about Fusarium, and now it's all about Pythium, because we're planting early to maximize yield. these cool wet conditions. So it's I cannot go into a lot of specific about it, but I would just say we have new fungicide, insecticides, and nematicides in our development pipeline, and we are well suited for the future of U.S. Soybean growers and corn growers in the United States.
Great, thank you. Well, you'll have to keep us posted as those get closer to commercialization and move through your life cycle process there. So I am getting close to time, so we'll begin to wrap things up. I want to first, again, thank our speakers, Paula, Jason, and Sean, for taking the time to join us today and sharing their expertise. As always, I want to thank our participants for their time, and I hope that you found this information valuable. If you have any ideas for future webinars you'd like to see or topics that you'd like to see us follow up on, please send them to me at jdeering@issuesinc.com. And again, thank you to our sponsors, BASF, Bayer, and Syngenta for their support. Thanks again to the team working here behind the scenes. Again, this presentation will be made available online at seedworld.com. Thanks again, and we hope you have a terrific day. This is Julie Deering of SeedWorld signing off.